And now we're on Daf Mem Zayin Amud Beis. On the top line, V'yein Marbim Olav. Again, we're going through the Masechet Gerus. We're not going to mention all the terrible punishments for all the Averos, same with Dagdik and Olav. You know, even in those Miktas Onshim that we'll tell them about, we're not going to teach them all the Dikduki Chomer Onshim. We'll just notify him derech klal, like to say to him, before you came to Misgayer, if you ate chalev, you're not going to get kares. Before you came to Misgayer, if you mechal Shabbos, you're not going to get misa skila. Now, if you eat chalev, you'll get kares. If you'll violate the Shabbos, you'll be chayv skila. Kibel, if he accepts upon himself everything that we told him, all the mitzvahs and the onshim and the schar mitzvahs, then let's not delay. He's sincere. He's proven himself. He's made his appropriate declarations in front of the Beis Din Molanos on Biyad. Immediately we'll circumcise him. And ein mashin es mitzvah. We're not going to delay that. Now I'm not sure if this halacha of ein mashin es mitzvah applies in a very unique, special way with regard to gerus, or is it simply in gerus is just one example, one application of a general rule? I'm not sure. Now, nishtayru bo tzitzin ha'ma'akvin samila. We'll see what that means later on, but these are parts of the skin in the membrane that were not cut off and are absolutely critical in order to make the mila into a mila. The ma'akiv is a mila. And the mila is not a mila kshera until we cut off these tzitzin. Is then chosin u'malin so shnia. There's no special kula that applies to milas gerus. Milas gerus is a spitting image, an exact duplicate of mila in general. So we have to cut off those tzitzin like any mila in order for the gerus to be valid. Okay, now we need something else besides mila. We need tvila, but we're not going to immediately dunk him into the mikvah, because that's going to make it really machbid of a sacholi misrapi. We have to wait until he's fully healed from his bris milah, and then matbilan also miyad. Now during the tefillah, shnei talmidei chachamim, we'll soon see. We'll change the gears to 3. Talmidei chachamim omdim al gabav. At the moment of tefillah, he is reaching the epitome, the clincher of gerus, and now he has to be makabel on himself all mitzvahs, modinos on mitzvahs alos, mitzvahs chamuros, and then he goes into the mikveh taval the Allah. As soon as he gets up from the mikveh, hareu ki Yisrael chol dvar. He has the status of a Yisrael. We'll see later on that even if he changes his mind, he's just the Yisrael shechata. Isha, if a woman comes for gerus, and here we have to be very careful about the tvila with the Beis Din. It has to be in front of Beis Din, but for tznius reason. So what do? Women will take care of seeing to it that she goes into the mikveh until her neck, and she's now covered in front of the Beis Din. The Beis Din are at a distance, which may tell me to come omdelam b'chutz. They stand on the outside. Modinosa, mixes mitzvahs kalis, mixes mitzvahs chaburos. Chamuros, she's still sitting in the mayim, in the water, and then she's toveles. When she's toveles, they turn away, so they shouldn't see her when she gets out of the water. Echad ger v'echad eved mishuchrar. The dinim of gerus are identical. A ger and an eved meshuchar, because when you meshachar an eved knani, that itself is an act of gerus. Where and in what kind of a mikvah of mayim does the tvila of gerus have to take place? But makom shenida tovel hasham, in a mikvah that has arboim saw, that's kosher for tvilas nida, to be mater or baila, so too ger, the eved meshuchar tovlin, for their gerus in that mikvah. And even though we're talking about a different kind of tvila, we're not talking about tvila for the sake of tumah v'tara. Other mechuyave tvilos, are obligated in tefillah in order to achieve tara, to purify themselves from contamination. That has no application here in the case of gerus, but nevertheless, it's got to be a mikvah of arboim sa, the same mikvah for tara purposes. And therefore, the Brisa continues, Kol davar shechotitz b'tefillah, chotitz b'ger, u'b'eved meshuchra, u'b'nida. We have halach in tefillah of chatzitza. Now, this halach of chatzitza breaks down into two subcategories. There's a chatzitza doraisa, which separates most of his body from the water. And of course, he doesn't want the water to go directly onto his body. That's already chatzitza doraisa. But then there's chatzitza d'rabbanan, where only part of his body, the minority of his body, is separated from the water by this chatzitza. But he doesn't want that part of his body to be exposed to the water directly. Or you could have a case where most of his body is covered by this chatzitza, separated from the water, but he's not makbid. He couldn't care less if the water went inside and directly contacted with his body. Those are chatzitzas d'rabbanan. But in any event, all these dinim that apply to tfilas tara for purposes of taros, to be mitayr someone from tuma, and all the dinim of chatzitza, whether chatzitza d'oraisa or chatzitza that apostles the tfilah d'rabbanan, all those requirements are identical in tfilas eved meshuchar, and in ger. Now, interesting enough, the Brisa adds benida. Now, nida is also tmeya, so she should come under the general rule of magataros. But no, we're talking about nida lebaila, right? There's another dimension of nida, and it's separate, independent of tuma, and that is asura lebaila. She needs tefillah and mikvah, and all the dinim of chatzitza poseles apply to tefillas nida, even though we're talking about that dimension of tefillah for heter l'bayla. Now the Gemara tries to analyze this brisa. Omar Mar, the brisa says ger sheba, he comes to bezel is gaya. Omar lo mora isa shebasel is gaya. Why are you motivated for gerus? Modino so mixas kalos mixas kamuros, and maybe he'll be poresh, he'll drop the ball and say, I'm out of here because he's afraid of the Torah of the mitzvahs. And my timer, why are we working overtime here to try to dissuade him, to discourage him from mitzvahs? To parish nifrosh. And if he's poresh and he decides, thanks, but no thanks, I'm out of here, fine. We're not even motivated to be megayer, and the answer is the Omer Rabbi Chelbo Kashim Gerim Litzokis Apachas. Gerim have caused many problems. So this goes back even to the time of Yetzias Mitzrayim with the Erev Rav. They sometimes, unfortunately too often, they continue to be mamchich, they continue to be noeg, their maisim harishonim. Very hard for a ger to be totally disconnected and terminate all of his behavior patterns as a goy, as an Ovid Avodah Zarah, perhaps. Rashi adds another element to the equation. It's dangerous because very often the ger is not sincere, and yet we rely on him in horas isa veheter. In other words, he tells us you can eat from this because we'd already took off Trumas and Maisros. Dichsiv, and this is all based on a pasuk in the 14th chapter of Yeshaya Navi, v'nilva hager alechem v'nisfachu al beis Yaakov. The word v'nisfachu comes from the shoresh sapachas, which is a kind of a leprosy, and that's the danger of being megayer gerim. So therefore, we have to be absolutely convinced that he is sincere, and hopefully he will be dedicated to the mitzvos, and he won't deviate from the path of the Torah. Why is that, my timer? And the answer is that goyim are very makbid on mamona, on their mammon. They're not mochel, even a pachas mishava pruta. And when they hear about the chiyuv to leave leket chika peil anim and maisel anim, which is 10%, maybe they'll decide this is not for me. I can't commit myself to that lifestyle. And Omer Rab Chia bar Abba Rab Yochanan ben Noach nerag al pachas mishava pruta. If a guy steals from his friend even less than a shava pruta, then his friend, the victim of this theft, is so makvid, even about the smallest amount of money, small claims court, pachas mishava pruta. In his mind, that's a complete gzela. And the Torah says that as far as Ben Noach is concerned, this is a violation of gzela, and he's nerag oleh. And not only that, gezel Ben Noach lo nita li shama. So the goyim are very in tune in their very essential soul, to the severity of gzela because of the chashivas of mammon. And if somebody steals, it's such a terrible avera in Dine ben Noach that he can't even return the gzela. Some say that because he's chayiv misa for stealing, therefore we apply the principle of kimlei b'derabim. That's why it's lo nitan lishaman. But I mean, that's beset with problems because Hishaman is referring to the cheftzah nigzal. I mean, there's no din of kimlei rabbi on returning the cheftzah nigzal. And furthermore, I don't know b'chlal if kimlei b'derabim applies to non-Jews. But in any event, the ein marbin olav, we're not going to be marbe to mention all the terrible onchim for the averos, the medagdikin olav, and even with regard to those onshim that we do mention to him, we don't tell him all the dikdukei chomer onshim. We just notify him in a general sense that if you come to be misgayer, if you eat chalev, you'll get kares. If you violate the Shabbos, you will now be chayiv skill. But we don't go into all the details. Omar Abelazam Ikra, how do we know this? From whence do we derive that ein marbin olavim medagdikin? Dichsiv rus. It says vatera when Nami realized ki misametzesi laleches ita. The pasuk says that once Nami became aware of the fact that Rus was absolutely dedicated, misametzes, to go with her and to be a giores, then Nami declares vatechta ledaber elah. I'm not going to speak to her anymore. She terminates all her speeches because ein marbim u'medagdikim v'nager habolas gaya. Now we get into detail about that which Naomi told Rus. Amro la, Naomi said to Rus, Asir lan tchum Shabbos. Now, in all these cases, how do we derive what Rus really said, what Naomi really said to Rus from the response of Rus? Asir lan tchum Shabbos. We're not allowed to leave the tchum Shabbos. Let's say Alpayim Amma outside the city. And Rus's response was, Basher telchi elech. I accept upon myself to observe the Shabbos and to avoid violating the tchumen of Shabbos. These are tchumen. Weiter, what else does Naomi tell Rus? Aser lanu yichud. We're not allowed to be alone with, let's say, in the case of a woman who's married, she can't be alone with a man other than a husband. In the case of a man, he can't be alone with a married woman. And Rus's response was, I accept upon myself. Whatever strictures apply to where you sleep and where you go in privacy and so forth, I accept that upon myself. Naomi continues, Mefakdinon, we are obligated, 613. And Rus's response is, Amech Ami. I accept upon myself all 613. Now, how do we see this in Amech Ami? So he says here in the footnote that this is based on a pasuk, Vayisi lachem lelokim, vatem tiyuli la'am. that if you accept upon yourselves Elokim, my mastery over you, and I will dominate you with 613 commandments, then atem tiuli le'am. And that's what Rus had in mind when she responded, Amech Ami, I'm accepting upon myself to be Shomer all Taryag mitzvahs, so that I will be included in the Am, in Amech, the Am of HaKadosh Baruch. And the Marsha says that there's a gematria here in the word Amech, of Taryag, whatever. My Rebbe went with a more creative interpretation of this Amech Ami, that she accepted upon herself to be part of that strange history and all the persecutions of a Jew. Asir now, Nomi tells Rus, Avodas Kol Chavim. We are enjoined from any form of worship of idols. And Rus commits herself, Elokayach Elokai. I accept upon myself the Malchus of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Nomi says to Rus, Arba misos nimsu lebezdin. Those who are condemned to death for a capital crime fit into 4 different categories of misos bezdin. And Rus accepts it upon herself. Basher tamutzi amus. All the dinim of misa that apply. And basically she's saying that if Chas v'Shalom shall be mischayev misa, she accepts it upon herself. Nomi continues. Shnei kvarim nimsu lebezdin. The batei kvaris are separated for those who are put to death if they're condemned for a capital crime into 2 sections. One section in the cemetery is for chayvei skila usreifa, and that those are the most severe violations. And there's another section in the Jewish cemetery which is dedicated to nerogim v'nechnakim, who don't have such a severe misa. And Rus responds to Nomi v'sham ekaver, I accept upon myself to be buried according to the Torah law. Miyad, immediately, after all the answers that Nomi received from Rus, and she was completely convinced that Rus is misametzes to accompany her and to become a giores. At that point, Nomi stops. He terminates her speeches, all her attempts to dissuade Rus from being miskayer. Anyway, we see clearly that when Bezdin sees that the ger wants to be miskayer, sincere, then we don't have to be medagdik imo yoser and go into all the details of the punishments, as we saw by Nomi and Rus, that once Nomi was convinced that Rus wants to be miskayer, she stopped talking her out of it. The Brisa says, if the ger kibel accept upon himself, molino somiyat, we don't delay the milah. My timer, why not? Shehuye mitzvah lo mashahina. We don't delay the mitzvahs. Now we get to molu esager v'nichtayru bo tzitzin ha'ma'akvin ha'milah. The milah of this ger was not done properly. There were chatichos, there were pieces of orla that were ma'akiv es ha'milah that were left uncut. And the milah is therefore not ksher until they cut them. And therefore, we're going to have to do a repeat performance of the milah in order to guarantee that we're chotech those tzitzin. And that's the same din that we're seeing here in Gerus that applies to any milah of any Yisrael. Kidisnan. Elu hein tzitzin ma'akvin es ha'milah. Which of these pieces of membrane are absolutely critical, such that after he cuts the foreskin, the milah is ma'akiv es ha'milah, and it's not a milah kshera. He has to go back and cut those chatichos of or, of skin. Basar chofes rov haTorah. The tzitzin are ma'akvin es ha'milah because this is basar, which covers most of the Torah, and the crown, which according to most Rishonim means that in one particular spot, the Rov HaTorah is still covered by a membrane, by skin. And if he's a Kohen, ein ochel b'truma, because if Nishtar Botzitzim Akvin Samili, he's an Orel, and an Orel is not allowed to eat Truma or Kodshim. The Omar Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba, Omar Rav, in the name of Rav, when it says in the Mishnah, Basar Chofes Rov HaTorah, Basar Chofer Rov Gova Shal HaTorah, the Mishnah does not mean that he left behind skin which covers most of the entire hekef of the Azara, of the Atorah. Even if he left behind the skin that covers Rov Gova, as we said, in one makom, one place, that's considered tzitzin ha'ma'akvin ha'samila. Nisrape, after the ger is restored to health, then and only then matbilan also miyat. Nisrape in lo, nisrape lo. We're not going to rush him into the mikvah. We have to wait until he gets a bill of health from the hospital or from the moil. The Maya Marzu Maka. The Mayim could actually make the wound even more severe. And this could be a danger to his life. So therefore, we have to delay the meal until the tefillah until Misrape. We derive from Mishpat that the Torah requires 3 Talmidei Chacham b'shas gerus. So the Gemara answers, Rabbi Yochanan said, Litana, well, we have to tell the Tana that Tni Shlosha, that he should make sure the Girsa is correct, is accurate to say 3 Talmidei Chacham, not 2. It seems pshita that after he had already Mila, now he had Tefillah, that he's Yisrael Gomer. So what are you telling me? Yisrael L'chol Dvarav, what's the Chiddush? And the Gemara answers, the Hadar Bey, if he decides, I don't want his Gerus, he has Charata from his Gerus. He realizes it's not for him, and he made a big mistake, and he was Mekadesh as Isha. You would think that once he's Mischarit, then somehow retroactively he undermines the Gerus, and therefore he's a guy, and the Kedusha of Bas Yisrael now is not valid. No, he's the Yisrael Mumar Kridabe. We categorize him as the Yisrael who never went off the path, the Kedusha of Kedusha, and we recognize the validity of his Kedusha, and therefore she, if she wants to marry someone else, needs a get. We're not going to say that he's a goy gomer as if he wasn't misguy. The Brayse says echad ger v'echad eved mishuchrar, because al kedaitach, the Gemara thinks right now that an eved mishuchrar, we have to be careful to notify him about the mitzvahs. The kabel olav ol mitzvah. So at the time the tefillas shichur, we have to notify him of the mitzvahs. So the Gemara asks for a minu. I'll ask you a stira from a brisa that says just the opposite. When do we require formal acceptance of Kabbalah's old mitzvahs? That's only beger. That's only for a non-Jew who is misgayer. And we cannot force him to be misgayer and accept him part himself the old mitzvahs. He must accept it willingly and be mekabel old mitzvahs mirtzono, from his absolute commitment and his will. We don't need him to mekabel mitzvahs at the time of the shichur, because of the time that he initially became an eved. He was tovel l'shem avdus, and he was already obligated in the mitzvahs, as the pasuk says in Dvar Perkei Laman Yanuach Avducha v'Mascha Kamocha. So therefore, since the Eved already at the beginning of his Avdus has accepted through that Gerus old mitzvahs, now when the Adon frees him and is Meshacher him, we don't need the Eved to be Makabal of old mitzvahs. Meaning, the completion of his Gerus, let's say his Gerus is now 90%, as an Eved Ivri, as an Eved Canaan. Now we need a Gerus to jack it up another 10 notches to 10%. He has no choice in the matter. It's only the Avdus itself, the Kinyan of the Adon on the Eved, that prevents the Gerus from completing. But in and of itself, the Gerus at the time when this Eved became an Eved Kanani, that is a complete Gerus. We just have to remove the blockage of Avdus, and that's removed when the Adon delivers a get shichur to the Eved. And at that point, we matvil him l'shem shichur, l'shem gerus shel shichur, against his will even. We don't need his will. We already had the gerus in 90% of it. Amarav Sheshes, so now we still have to answer up the brisa that says that there is halacha in shichur Eved of hodas ha-mitzvahs, lo kasha ha Rabbi Shimon Elazar ha Rabbanan. This last brisa that differentiates fundamentally between an Eved Meshuchah and a Ger. In the case of an Eved Meshuchah, we're not going to wait for his ratzon and his declaration that he wants to be Mekabel al mitzvahs. That's Rabbi Shimon Elazar. An Eved Meshuchah is not required to be Mekabel al mitzvahs at the time of the Shichur. But the brisa that we brought earlier, the first brisa, that equates an Eved to a Ger, just 1 second. I think there's a mistake here. I don't know. I just noticed it now. The first brisa that equates an Eved to a Ger holds that there's no difference, it should say, no difference between an Eved Meshuchrar and a Ger. And that's the Rabbanan against Rabbi Shimon Elazar. The Rabbanan hold that an Eved Meshuchrar has to be Mekabel ol mitzvahs at the time of the Shichur. The Sanya we learned in the brisa. The Torah says in the parasha of Eishes Yifas Toar at the beginning of Kitetse, Ubachsa es avia ves ima, and there's a whole long process, part by part, din by din, a complicated set of dinim that have to be fulfilled for this Eishes Yifas Torah to become a full-fledged Giores. And the Bryce says, V'amendor Mamurim, when do we have to guarantee to be Makayim in Eishes Yifas Torah all these nuances, these meisim that are mentioned in the parasha, after which he who took this Eishes Yifas Torah could be Magayer Habal Karcha, is that's only Shalom Kibla, well, she did not accept upon herself with a free acceptance, a free commitment, all mitzvahs. But Aval Kibla Olev, she decides that she's willing to accept the mitzvahs, and she now wants Gerus. We don't need to do all these mice in the parasha, but rather my tefillah, we just do the tefillah l'shem Gerus, and in that way the Gerus is chal, and she's a full-fledged Giores. Umuter ba miyad, and immediately he can have a marriage relationship with her. Rav Shimon Elazar Omer, afal pichlo kibla aleh, even if she didn't accept upon herself willingly and express her desire to be misgayer, kofe umadbilo l'shem shivchos, against her will, we can compel her to have the tefillah for the purpose of shivchos, and through this tefillah, she becomes shivchasa. Once she's shivchasa, then choser umadbila l'shem shichrur umeshachara. There's a second tefillah for the purpose of shichrur, umuter ba miyad on the top of memches. We don't have to wait a month, like a stam Eishes Yifas Torah. So in any way, just to summarize, Rabbi Shimon holds that all the dim of the parsha and all the requirements that Eishes Yifas Torah, with all their minutia, only apply if she doesn't want to be misgayer. But if she, on her own initiative, her own inner will, would like to become a Giores, then Yesh biyado latir miyat. We can circumvent all these individual actions and steps, because Rabbi Shimon holds that matbilinus ha'eved bal karcho, and we don't need for the eved to be mekabel ol mitzvahs at the time of the tefillah shichur. The Rabbanan, on the other hand, hold that an eved tzarech is required lekabel of ol mitzvahs. The ein matbilinus bal karcho. So this is where we're going to stop for today, here on the top of Memches Amud Aleph, and Amir Hashem, tomorrow we'll learn Daf Memches. A good moed.